Kurt Busch could be returning to Cup Series pretty soon, and Chip Ganassi Racing has not ruled out a potential possibility to return to NASCAR. What's going on, guys? It's Daniel, and welcome back to your video. We got a ton of NASCAR and other motorsports stories discussed here today on the channel. Let's go ahead and just jump straight into those really quickly. We're going to go ahead and start talking about Valvoline. As it was announced on Friday that Valvoline is going to sponsor Kyle Larson for 3 races in 2023. The first race is going to be Sonoma, the final race on Maine Fox. Then we will see the NEM next at New Hampshire, and then finally the final race will run will be at the Bristol Night Race. Valvoline, of course, sponsored Kyle Larson for the last couple years. The paint scheme looks absolutely incredible. I really love it, and I'm looking forward to see this car out on the racetrack. I think it looks awesome, and I'm excited to see it out on the racetrack at those 3 races. And now we're going to hedge on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about MrBeast. Now, if you watched the most recent MrBeast video, you obviously knew this was coming, but MrBeast was spotted at the Daytona 500. And what was going on was he flew a blimp saying Carl's mom over the Daytona 500. I think it's really cool to see MrBeast was at the Daytona 500. I think MrBeast might be a NASCAR fan. I thought it was really cool to see that he was at the Daytona 500, and I think it's pretty exciting to see that he flew a blimp over. That's pretty exciting, pretty awesome, and good to see the collab he has done with NASCAR. That's pretty exciting stuff overall, to be honest with you. And now we're going to hedge on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Chandler Smith. Now, as reported by Joseph Swigley, does some really interesting Swigley facts every single week, that Chandler Smith is the first driver to win in multiple series born after January 1st, 2000. Obviously, Chandler Smith has won quite a few Truck Series races in his career, but of course, he won his first career NASCAR Xfinity Series race this past weekend at Richmond Raceway. Congratulations, Chandler Smith, on becoming the first to do that. I think that's really good to see, and seeing Chandler Smith how good he's been close to winning the Xfinity Series already multiple times, and I think Chandler Smith is going to win a lot of races in his career. But major congratulations to Chandler Smith on accomplishing that feat. Pretty awesome stuff to see. In my honest opinion, pretty awesome stuff. And now we're going to hedge on to the next story of today's episode as we're going to talk about Kyle Busch. Now, we got a couple Kyle Busch stories we're going to be talking about in today's episode, but Kyle Busch first reported, was reported by Davey Siegel and Deb Williams as well, that Kyle Busch has been in the Chevy simulator in the last 2 months more than he had been in Toyota's simulator in the last 3 years. I find that very interesting because Kyle Busch, obviously, the last 3 years, look at his performance. Kyle Busch generally had struggled those last years outside of a couple wins. You look at Kyle Busch generally so far in 2023 with how much he's been in the Chevy simulator, and Kyle Busch's performance since getting to that 8 car, while the 8 cars are extremely fast, Kyle Busch's performance on the racetrack has definitely gotten a lot better. And I think it has a lot to do with being in that Chevy simulator, and I think it's helped Kyle Busch out quite a bit. So pretty exciting to see for sure that Kyle Busch has been showing a lot of pace and a lot of speed, and overall I think being in that Chevy simulator has helped Kyle Busch out quite a bit. So pretty good to see that for sure, and glad to see that Kyle Busch is continuing to get better on the racetrack as well. And now we're going to hedge on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Trey Hutchins. As is reported by Steven Stumpf, who works at Front Stretch, that Trey Hutchins is hoping to do 4 or 5 more races in the 2023 NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series season. Trey Hutchins generally runs about 5 to 6 races every single year in the Truck Series, and they're generally the big races. He's looking at maybe running Charlotte and maybe also running Nashville as well. He can't run the full season because they don't have the funding and sponsorship to run all the races, and they don't have the equipment as well to run all those races as well. That being said, though, I think it's cool to see a Trey Hutchins is trying to run a lot more races. I hope he runs a lot more, and hopefully we'll see him in a lot more races throughout the 2023 NASCAR Truck Series season. Glad to see he wants to run some more races. And now we're going to hedge on to the next story of today's episode as we are talking about Will Power. As it was announced on Friday that Will Power has signed a multi-year contract extension with Team Penske. This has been expected. It's been rumored since St. Petersburg that this was going to happen, but the contract will go through at least the 2025 season. Will Power, of course, has won multiple championships for Team Penske at this point and won many races for Team Penske. Has been performing really good. Outside of Texas, he's been generally the last couple of years really strong. And I think Will Power is only going to continue to get a lot better. I think he's a driver who's got a lot of potential to do a lot more great things in the sport. And maybe this year he'll go back-to-back in championships. We'll have to wait and see. It's going to be really tough to beat Joseph Newgarden this season, but it's really awesome to see that we're going to see Will Power continue driving for the team for a long time. And regardless, it's good to see his performance continuing to get better. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're going to talk about Colton Herta. As before the weekend began for IndyCar, Colton Herta, who of course is sponsored by Gamebridge, got into Nick Sanchez's truck and did a little bit of a driver swap. Now, obviously, Colton Herta is sponsored by Gamebridge, and Nick Sanchez is also sponsored by Gamebridge. Now, it's no secret that Colton Herta has indicated in the past that he has wanted to maybe drive in a truck race. In fact, he almost drove at Eldora back, I think, in 2019. Colton Herta, it would be very fun for him to run a truck race, especially a race in NASCAR in general. I know he's indicated in the past that he wants to race in NASCAR. I think it'd be really fun to have him either in the Truck Series or the Xfinity Series. It doesn't really matter at this point. I would love to see Colton Herta get an opportunity to race in NASCAR. Maybe Gamebridge can open him up, hook him up, and maybe they get a truck for Rev Racing, a second truck maybe, and maybe he runs a truck race later this year. I think it'd be really fun, and maybe we'll see Colton Herta get an opportunity to race in NASCAR, because I think it would be really fun for him to run in NASCAR. Hopefully he does get an opportunity to do that in the foreseeable future, because I think that would be really, really fun, in my opinion. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about Josh Williams. Now, Josh Williams, for the NASCAR Xfinity Series race began at Richmond Raceway, he delivered pizzas to the NASCAR hauler. And he delivered pizzas to a lot of people in the garage as well. It was Papa John's Pizza. And basically, Wayne Otten, who's the race director for Xfinity, was not amused by what Josh Williams did. Obviously, if you know the story, Josh Williams got parked and basically parked his car on the front stretch. Then in the NASCAR hauler, got kept there for multiple hours. He basically ate pizza in the NASCAR hauler. And then he got suspended for one race, and now he's back behind the wheel. Obviously, I think that's really cool to see. In my opinion, we should get him to be sponsored by Papa John's Pizza or some sort of pizza company, because I think that'd be pretty cool if that ended up happening. But I thought that was a really cool story, and great to see that he's playing along with it, having fun with it. I think it's really cool to see that Josh Williams deliver pizzas to the NASCAR hauler. Pretty awesome stuff. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Kyle Larson. Now, Kyle Larson, of course, won the NASCAR Cup Series race in Richmond, but in the media center, Kyle Larson said that he was flipping through YouTube videos this past week of 2021 races to remind himself that he used to be really, really good. Now, Kyle Larson, of course, in 2021 had a complete domination season where he scored 10 wins. Now, last year, Kyle Larson scored, of course, 3 wins, which is still pretty good, but Kyle Larson made a lot of mistakes. So far in 2023, he's made some mistakes, but he finally, of course, got that monkey off his back and finally has a win this season. I think Kyle Larson is going to win a lot of races this year. I think that 5 team has been extremely strong, and for him to watch a lot of videos and remind himself how good he is, I think Larson is still one of the best drivers in the Cup Series to this day. I think he's only going to get better as the season progresses. But congratulations to Kyle Larson on getting it done, and it's good to see Larson's watching those videos. He reminded himself how good he is. So trust me, Kyle Larson is still one of the best in the Cup Series garage. In my opinion, I think he's still one of the best drivers we have currently in the sport at this current moment. I think he's going to continue to get better and do more great things in the sport long term. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Dean Thompson. Now, if you watched the Craftsman Truck Series race at Texas Motor Speedway, Dean Thompson was having a career day, was up in the top 5 a lot of that race, and was running really good. Unfortunately, Dean Thompson suffered a pretty scary accident on the front stretch. He got loose, and unfortunately, Matt Mills, who had no brakes at the time, collided into Dean Thompson, and then multiple other drivers, that being Trey Hutchins and Armani Williams, also collided into Dean Thompson as well. Dean Thompson was put on a stretcher and sent to the hospital. Well, Dean Thompson released an update a few hours later, said he was getting some CAT scans, and he said he was okay, and he was released from the hospital yesterday morning. Really good to see that Dean Thompson has been released from the hospital. Obviously, he has to get clearance to race for Bristol Dirt this weekend. We're not sure if he'll be able to race this weekend at Bristol Dirt because he's not been medically cleared by NASCAR to go race at this time. There was unfortunately ARCA brakes in that situation. I know that Matt Mills explained that he had no brakes in the car, and he said he also could not see Dean Thompson in the wreck. Very scary situation, very scary incident on what happened there, and he's got to use your brakes a little bit. I know, like I said, that Dean Thompson did, well, Matt Mills said that he had no brakes, but I'm wishing nonetheless, I'm wishing the best for Dean Thompson. Good to see he's been released from the hospital. That was a very scary accident and a very scary wreck, and just an awful situation, in my opinion, on all fronts and all aspects. So glad to see that Dean Thompson at least is somewhat okay in that situation. Hopefully he will recover really quickly, and hopefully he will be back behind the wheel this weekend at Bristol Dirt. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Jessica Friesen. As it was announced yesterday morning that Jessica Friesen is going to drive the 62 for Hallmark Friesen Racing this weekend at Bristol Dirt. Jessica Friesen made a couple starts last year in the Truck Series in both Truck Series dirt races at Bristol Dirt and also Knoxville. Of course, last time she raced in Knoxville, she ended up flipping upside down, but we never really got a great replay and great indication on exactly how she basically flipped upside down. Obviously, Jessica Friesen, the wife of Stuart Friesen, has made a couple starts in the Truck Series. I think Jessica will do okay. We haven't seen Homer Friesen racing truck race a lot. Lane Riggs was supposed to drive this truck quite a bit this year. Unfortunately, Lane doesn't really have a sponsorship funding to run the full season currently at the moment, but I am happy to see that Jessica Friesen is getting the opportunity to race once again, and hope we should do a really good job for Homer Friesen Racing this weekend at Bristol Dirt. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Jonathan Davenport. As it was announced this morning that Jonathan Davenport, along with running for the 13 car for Colorado Racing in the Cup Series and making his debut there, he will get some additional track time and drive his 7 truck for Spire Motorsports this weekend at Bristol Dirt. Jonathan Davenport's one of the greatest late model drivers ever to race on dirt. He, of course, like I said, will make his NASCAR Cup Series debut with Colorado Racing this weekend, of course, if he's able to make the field. But Jonathan Davenport, a legend of the sport, he knows how to get it done. And I think Jonathan Davenport has got to be a sleeper pick for this weekend's truck race especially. Spire Motorsports team, I know they missed the show at COTA, but I really believe this time around, unlike COTA, they're not going to have any issues. And I think that Jonathan Davenport will be able to make the field. And I think that Jonathan Davenport is going to be a pretty strong contender this weekend for Spire Motorsports at Bristol. So watch Jonathan Davenport, because I think he's got a good shot to contend. And I'm excited to see he will get the opportunity to race at Bristol Dirt this weekend in the Truck Series, along with the Cup race as well. Really looking forward to it, and I'm excited to see he's getting behind the wheel this weekend. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Scott McLaughlin. Now, Scott McLaughlin was doing a Q&A last night after the IndyCar race, which we'll get to here in just a little bit. But Scott McLaughlin was asked a question about NASCAR. Have you ever been interested in racing in NASCAR? And Scott McLaughlin has said yes. He is interested in racing in NASCAR. Now, obviously, Scott McLaughlin raced in V8 Supercars for Penske, and he had a choice of maybe going to NASCAR or going to IndyCar. And there was rumors at one point a few years ago that he was going to drive for Team Penske on a full-time basis in Xfinity, if I'm not mistaken. However, he decided to change his mind and went over and raced in IndyCar on a full-time basis, and he's been pretty successful in IndyCar and has had some success winning quite a few races already up to this point. I hope that Scott McLaughlin, though, decides to race in NASCAR, maybe for Team Penske in the Xfinity Series, because obviously that program was being rumored at one point to race. But he's done a really good job in IndyCar so far up to this point in his career. I wanted to say focus in IndyCar, but I would love for Scott McLaughlin to get this shot and get the opportunity of a lifetime to race in NASCAR. So hopefully it does end up happening where he gets to race in NASCAR in the foreseeable future. But he's been successful in IndyCar, and I hope he continues to focus on that. But I also hope we get to see him in the foreseeable future race in NASCAR, because I think it'd be really fun to have him in NASCAR. So hopefully he'll get the opportunity and a shot to race in NASCAR in the future. And now we're going to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're going to talk about the last lap crash at Texas Motor Speedway between Nick Sanchez and Carson Hocevar. So if you watch a Truck Series race, in my opinion, a pretty big disaster for the Truck Series, right? Not a good race. Well, in the last lap of the race, you had Zane Smith and Nick Sanchez battling for the lead. Coming to the white flag, Nick Sanchez goes up to side draft Zane Smith. And Nick Sanchez got a little bit loose and a little bit sideways and came back down. Carson Hocevar was right there. Carson had nowhere to go, and he unfortunately turned Nick Sanchez hard up in the outside wall, collecting Zane Smith and Christian Eckes, and Carson Hocevar would get his first win. Now, Carson Hocevar did apologize to Nick Sanchez. He didn't mean to do it. He just had nowhere to go, and he's going for his first win as well. Nick Sanchez's interview, he handled it with a lot of class and a lot of respect and handled it very, very well. Nick Sanchez is going to win a lot of races and trucks this year. He's been really strong, really, really quick, and hasn't gotten to finishes to show for it, but Nick Sanchez has been a contender at pretty much every single race so far this year. I think he's a championship favorite. I know he's not in the playoffs currently at the moment, but Nick Sanchez has been looking really strong to start off the 2023 Truck Series season up to this point. And I really appreciate how Nick Sanchez handled that situation. Should have won the race, led over 160 laps. The drivers behind him showed no respect on the track, and they're racing completely like with their heads up their butts. And it was frustrating to watch at times. But I think Nick Sanchez is going to win a lot of races in his career, and I think Nick is going to be a successful driver, and I really appreciate the class. But I'm also happy that Carson Hocevar got his first win. Carson probably did not want to win that way, but it was not intentional from his position. I think it was just an accident, and he didn't mean to do that. But still, just an unfortunate situation how the race ended. But I'm happy to see that we got to see Carson Hocevar get his first win. I appreciate Nick Sanchez handling it with a lot of class. And now we're going ahead to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about the Australian Grand Prix. Now, the Australian Grand Prix for us in the United States was very late at night. And I just want to say that the Australian Grand Prix was kind of a disaster. There are 3 red flags in this race. The first time in Formula 1 history that has happened. There's usually been sometimes 2 red flags. There were 3 red flags. And it was going to be a very easy win for Max Verstappen. And you're going to have Lewis Hamilton easily finish second and Fernando Alonso finish third. Well, the race would go into a crap show where you'd have basically them red flag because Magnussen basically had a lot of damage. They basically red flag it and decided to basically go and have another restart. And then we had another crap show where they red flagged it again, where a bunch of cars ended up wrecking. And Fernando Alonso got turned. Carlos Sainz got a penalty, but then they basically didn't get through the first sector. So they basically even gave Carlos Sainz a penalty, even though they didn't get through the first sector. But Max Verstappen would be able to hold on and get his second win of the 2023 season. Lewis Hamilton would get second, and Fernando Alonso would finish third. Carlos Sainz ended up not getting any points, despite the fact that basically he should have gotten points. Nico Hulkenberg was potentially going to get a podium, and he got robbed of it, so they're, of course, appealing the penalty and basically have appealed and are trying to overturn that call. But nonetheless, congratulations to Max Verstappen on getting another victory. It's a shame that the F1 race decided to go NASCAR way, and it ended at like 3 in the morning, which, again, that was just a frustrating race to watch overall at the end of the day, and probably the worst race of the weekend for sure. Just disappointing to watch overall, but congratulations nonetheless to Max Verstappen on getting the win at the Australian Grand Prix, because he deserved that win, in my honest opinion. And now we're going ahead to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about Jeff Gordon. Now, Josh Berry, of course, had a very good day at Richmond yesterday and a finishing runner-up in the race. Jeff Gordon came by and spoke to the media as well, and he says that Josh Berry has a future in the NASCAR Cup Series. I 100% agree with Jeff Gordon on this one. Josh Berry, outside of one race where he had some incidents, Josh Berry has been running very, very good this year. His average finish is 10th place in those select starts, and Josh Berry has gotten a couple top 10s in that 9 car. That's not me saying that he should be in the 9 car, because that's Chase Elliott's Ryan. We'll get into Chase Elliott here in a little bit. But I think if I'm Junior Motorsports, I'm looking at Junior Motorsports jumping up the Cup, or another team like Spire for that matter. And if I'm looking at potential availability for Josh Berry, JL Jr. is probably going to have to try to long-term sign Josh Berry, because you look at Josh Berry and the teams, there's a lot of teams that want Josh Berry right now, and they want to put him in a full-time ride, because I think Josh Berry, he's gotten better as time has gone on, and his pace and performance on the racetrack, especially considering he really did not have any experience up to this point, he's been very, very good in my opinion. And I believe that Josh Berry is going to be a future driver in the Cup Series next year. I think if you're a team, you got to be looking at Berry as a potential possibility to pick him up. But you also look at Junior Motorsports. They've been rumored to maybe jumping up the Cup next year, and maybe it will happen, but it's all going to come down to the charters and such. That being said, though, if you're in a position there, you've got to get him signed up long-term, because if you don't, you're going to potentially lose him if you're Dale Jr. So we'll see what Dale Jr. does, but hopefully we'll see him sign him long-term, because I think it's not going to be long before Josh Berry's in a full-time Cup race. So we'll see what happens going forward, but I don't think it'll be long before we see Josh Berry full-time, and I hope that Dale Jr. can sign him up long-term so he can stay with the team in a long-term position. Hopefully that ends up happening long-term. And now we're going ahead to jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Daniel Suarez. Now, we have a couple Daniel Suarez stories to talk about in today's episode, but the first story revolves around his situation with Ross Chastain. Now, Daniel Suarez, obviously, after the NASCAR Cup Series race at COTA, was very unhappy with Ross Chastain. And he basically spoke on Chastain in the media center, and he says that he has mended fences with Chastain as of Saturday. Obviously, we saw the situation there where he was really pissed off with Ross Chastain, but it's good to see that both teammates were happy, at least not happy with each other, but at least they're at least able to mend fences and come to terms. Because if this team is going to see long-term, and Trackhouse Racing is going to succeed long-term, both teammates are going to have to work together. And there are going to be times where teammates are going to have differences. You look at Chase Elliott and Kyle Larson last year. They had a couple instances where they were mad at each other. We had instances in the past where Denny Hamlin and Kyle Busch were mad at each other back in 2010. And also, Brad Keselowski was mad at Joey Logano in 2021. But for this team to succeed long-term, they're going to have to work together. Getting into each other in a race especially is not going to help on those terms. That being said, though, I'm glad to see that they've basically been able to make up in that situation. They're going to be the team, I think, that's really successful, and they've both been pretty successful up to their points. Suarez already got a win with Trackhouse, and you look at Ross Chastain as well, and they've already been very successful so far up this point. And they need to continue to work together and show a lot more respect with each other. So I'm glad to see they've both been able to make up make up on the terms right there, and hopefully that it will continue long term, and we'll see them continue to be successful as teammates, because they're going to have to be successful as teammates going forward if they want to succeed long term. And now we're going ahead to move on to the next story of today's episode, as we're going to talk about the PPG 375 from Texas Motor Speedway. This race was an absolute banger. We got to see the most lead changes in an IndyCar race since 2001 at Texas Motor Speedway, including the NASCAR man. And this race was just amazing. So much side by side. I was worried about Texas because, again, Texas is a track that hasn't produced good racing. But this was the best IndyCar race I've seen at Texas Motor Speedway, and probably the best race at Texas I've seen since the reconfiguration in 2017. It was a banger, so much side-by-side racing, and a great finish ended off with Joseph Newgarden getting the win. You have drivers like Romain Grosjean leading, Alex Palou leading. At one point, though, Pato O'Ward had nearly a one-lap lead over the whole entire field just because of how dominant he was. But it was an entertaining race nonetheless, and I absolutely enjoyed it. And I think the drivers put on a really good and a really strong showing. And it just shows that these drivers can race really, really hard, but also with a lot of respect on the racetrack. And it was just, as a fan of the sport, it was very, very fun to watch, and I absolutely enjoyed it. It was a great race overall, and I hope that IndyCar goes to more ovals, because the oval racing in IndyCar, especially, if this is what it's going to be like, I think Iowa's going to be fun, and I think the Indy 500 is also going to be good, and I think Gateway could be another good race as well. But nonetheless, I'm excited that the IndyCar had a great race, and congratulations to Joseph Newgarden on picking up the victory. It was overall a really awesome and a really strong race, and it was a very fun race to watch for sure. I absolutely enjoyed it. And now we're going ahead to move on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Bubba Wallace. Now, we've talked about Bubba Wallace a couple times on this channel about Bubba Wallace's comments after Circuit Americas, where he's frustrated with himself and he said he needed to be replaced. Obviously, over the week, we talked about how Denny Hamlin, I think a couple other people at 2311, including Steve Valletta, has spoken about Wallace that they need to be working together. Now, Bubba Wallace spoke to the media before the race began this weekend, and he spoke on his frustration, basically said what he had to do. His wife, Amanda, was pretty worried about Bubba at the time. He was throwing weights around, he was smashing tables, and basically up until Thursday, he was really, really frustrated about how he had been. But he came to Richmond saying he was ready to go and get on the track, and he was able to release anger in a safe space over the week as well. Bubba Wallace is a driver that has to show that. I'm glad to see Bubba Wallace is ready to go. Obviously, Richmond did not go well for him, unfortunately. His pit crew kind of screwed up and went from having a potential top 10 day to finishing in 22nd. Bubba Wallace is a driver that lives in the moment and also shows that frustration. But I'm happy to see, nonetheless, that Bubba Wallace came to the weekend ready to go and full of energy and stuff, and just ready to go out on the racetrack, because that's what he's got to do. He's got to hone in that anger and hone in that frustration, because he's a driver that is going to be with 2311 Racing for many years, and a driver who's probably going to win quite a few races. He doesn't need to be replaced. He just needs to basically be able to show that and get some emotional check. And I think with Michael Jordan, Denny Hamlin being there and patting him on the back and stuff, I think that's really going to help out him as well, along with Kurt Busch being there and Todd Reddick being there. I think that's going to help Bubba Wallace out in a pretty big way. And I think when you look at Bubba and the talent he has shown, it's just disappointing to see his frustration, because he's a great talent. He's a great driver, and I have a lot of respect for him. And I think if he can get that honed in and checked, I think he's going to do a lot of great things in this sport. I know, like I said, I know Richmond did not go well for him, but I really think that nonetheless, you're going to see Bubba Wallace get better as a driver, and I think he's just got to hone that in and get help from his team, because I think he'll be a better driver if he shows it. So really good to see that Bubba Wallace showed some basically just emotional check, just release some anger, frustration. Hopefully, we'll see Bubba Wallace's performance get better on the racetrack and his confidence can get back up. But Richmond did not go well for him, so we'll see what happens this upcoming week at Bristol Dirt. That's a track to watch for this week, and we'll see what Bubba Wallace can do at Bristol Dirt this weekend. And now we're going ahead to move on to the next story of today's episode, as we are talking about Kyle Busch. Now, we have a couple more stories around Kyle Busch to talk about today, but the next one we're talking about is about Kyle Busch, and basically said that he is against running the Indy road course. He basically said that if fans are not showing up at the Indy road course, we should just be running on the Indianapolis Oval. I 100% agree with Kyle Busch on this front. Now, don't get me wrong, I do like the Indy road course, but you're not getting a lot of fans to show up at the Indy road course. And let's be honest, the drivers lose a lot of respect at the Indy road course, and I'm really worried about the racing at the Indy road course, where we probably should have single file restarts for some of the upcoming road course races going forward. Maybe not Watkins Glen and Sonoma. Maybe we go to Indy Road Course, and maybe we go to Chicago Street Course, and we have single file restarts. But Kyle Busch is absolutely right on one thing, is the fact that I think the Indy Road Course we should be running on the Indy Oval. And I think we should try the next-gen car on the Indy Oval, especially with it being a flat track. I think the racing could be very soft. I'm not saying the racing is going to be spectacular, but we should definitely give the Indy Oval a try next year in 2024. And we know that the officials and the president of Indianapolis, Doug Bowles, has indicated in the past that they've basically wanted to go ahead and do that. But at the same token, same time, we're going to have to see what they decide to do. But I agree with Kyle Busch. I think you're going to have more fans show up, especially, and you look at TV ratings as well for the Indy Road Course races, the ratings have been terrible. They've been in the 2 million range. And this year, the Indy Road Course race, I think, is on USA, so the ratings are going to be worse. And usually it's on NBC, but I think it's this year on USA, if I'm not mistaken. So I really think, and I agree with Kyle Busch, that we should be running on the Indy Oval and not the Indy Road Course. I know some fans will disagree with me on that, but I do believe that we should be racing for sure on the Indy Oval going forward and not the Indy Road Course. We'll see what Indianapolis decides to do, what NASCAR decides to do, but I do believe 100% that we should be running on the Indy Oval and not the Indy Road Course. I agree 100% with Kyle Busch on that front. And now we're going ahead, jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about Chase Elliott. Now, obviously, Chase Elliott is currently out at the moment, and we don't know how long it's going to be, how Chase Elliott is going long he's going to be out. Well, Bob Poggers put out a tweet responding to a fan yesterday and indicates that Chase Elliott has no update at this point currently, but it's still the timetable currently moment for Chase Elliott to return could be within the next 2 to 3 weeks. That could be at Martinsville, it could be at Talladega, but right now it all depends on how his recovery goes. Now, Chase Elliott is still recovering from an injury he suffered in a skiing accident, and right now is currently out at the moment. Right now, Josh Berry will be in that car for all the oval tracks, including, I believe, Bristol Dirt this weekend, and he'll be out at least for the next few weeks. Obviously, Chase Elliott needs to take the right steps to get back to the racetrack. I really hope Chase Elliott can get back to the racetrack as soon as possible, but he needs to continue taking the right steps and go in the right direction to get back behind the wheel, because if he continues to take those right steps, he'll be back behind the wheel in no time. I think Chase Elliott also is going to be really hungry to perform, and whenever he does get back behind the wheel, I think it'll take a second for him to get acclimated back behind the wheel, but I do believe that Chase Elliott will be very, very competitive when he gets back behind the wheel, but again, I think it'll take a second to get acclimated. But I expect that we're going to see Chase Elliott back behind the wheel sooner rather than later, and I think he'll be very, very quick, especially maybe on the road courses and some of the other tracks as well. Or maybe we're going to see someone get in, at least he'll start the race, and maybe he'll have someone finish the race for him whenever he does get back behind the wheel. I think his race will come back as Talladega. That's the race. That's when I think he'll come back. I know Martinsville's been rumored at one point, but I think Martinsville will be a little bit too soon. I think it'll be either Talladega or it'll be at Dover, one of those two races where I think he'll be coming back to the racetrack. Hopefully Chase Elliott does get back to the racetrack really, really soon and can get back behind the wheel of a NASCAR Cup Series car. Hopefully he'll be back here in the foreseeable future. And now we're going ahead, jump on to the next story of today's episode, as we're talking about J.J. Yeley versus Denny Hamlin. Now, if you watched the NASCAR Cup Series race at Richmond yesterday, Denny Hamlin, basically at COTA, he basically called out a ton of drivers. Well, Denny Hamlin had a rough day at Richmond yesterday. And it all started after a speeding penalty where Denny Hamlin was very, very frustrated at J.J. Yeley. And Denny Hamlin got squeezed a little bit. Basically, he intentionally dumped J.J. Yeley going into turn number 1, forced him in the inside wall, and then he hit his back into the outside wall. Look, Denny Hamlin had every right and every reason to be frustrated, but you don't dump a car into turn 1 and intentionally wreck the guy, especially after you went on your podcast and called out a bunch of people throughout the week, and then you do that where you intentionally dump somebody. In my honest opinion, Denny Hamlin should have been called out there. And J.J. Yeley, after this, was very happy with Denny Hamlin and basically called out Denny Hamlin, basically saying, for a guy that preached a lot on his podcast, he basically drove me with no respect. And what's interesting is these two guys used to be teammates back in 2006 and 2007 when J.J. Yeley drove for Joe Gibbs Racing. But you got to show a lot of respect if you're out on the racetrack. And Denny Hamlin is probably going to get called out. And let's be honest, on actions detrimental, Denny Hamlin's probably going to call himself out on his speeding penalties and also probably going to call himself out on this incident. But when you look at this situation, Denny Hamlin was clearly at fault for the wreck. He intentionally jumped J.J. Yeley in a corner. And we saw a lot of lack of respect on the racetrack from Denny Hamlin at this particular corner. And I think you look at this, and J.J. Yeley has every right to be frustrated and upset with Denny Hamlin because he completely just straight up dumped him. He completely wrecked him and showed no respect. We talk about this a lot this week, but the lack of respect on the track especially has been unreal. And I think a lot of drivers were really frustrated with the situation and all that stuff. But I think Denny Hamlin is completely at fault for the incident, and Denny Hamlin should take responsibility for the wreck, and hopefully he will take responsibility for the incident. And now we're going ahead to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about Daniel Suarez. Now, Daniel Suarez once again spoke to the media about the situation at COTA, where basically he says that he didn't think he would be penalized after Circuit of the Americas when he basically ran into Alex Bowman on pit road. They said that his telemetry showed that Alex Bowman brake checked him. Well, I have to completely disagree with Daniel Suarez on this front because Daniel Suarez, he basically sped up. It took a long time for him to basically think about it. He sped up, went basically full throttle for a whole entire left, nearly went into the back of a ton of drivers, ran into drivers normally, and nearly went in the back of drivers, hit Ross Chastain coming into pit road, and then he ran into the back of Alex Bowman multiple times on pit road with officials standing right there. NASCAR is going to completely always frown upon that. And that's why I don't understand how Daniel Suarez felt like he feels like he doesn't deserve a penalty, which I completely disagree. Daniel Suarez ran into the back of Alex Bowman there, and that could have been extremely dangerous. I'm surprised he even thinks he wasn't going to get a penalty because that was clearly an offendable act and a penalty act. He ran it back of Alex Bowman, and if you do that on pit road with officials standing on there, that's completely dangerous and completely unacceptable, and he deserved a penalty right there. And the fact he thinks he shouldn't have gotten a penalty shows that drivers don't care and showing lack of respect. And I think 100% he should have gotten penalized for that. That was completely unacceptable from Daniel Suarez's front, and he deserved a penalty completely, in my opinion. I think it's a 100% deserved penalty, and he 100% shouldn't have got penalized for that. Again, I agree. He should have got penalized, and he deserved a penalty 100% on that front and on that aspect. I'm surprised he thinks he shouldn't have got a penalty because that was completely a suspendable act and probably could have gotten suspended for that if NASCAR wanted to be extremely harsh. Because he was joking about it on Twitter after that penalty. He should have easily gotten a point penalty and maybe even a suspension for that because that was a suspendable act that he did on pit road. Nonetheless, so Daniel Suarez is surprised he got a penalty, but he should have absolutely 100% gotten a penalty for that, in my opinion. Now we're going ahead and jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about the reactions from the garage on the Hendrick Motorsports appeal. Now, obviously, this past week on Wednesday, it was announced Hendrick Motorsports had received all their points back, the owner's points and the driver's points. However, basically, they still got to keep the suspensions, and they also got to keep the fines as well. The $100,000 fines basically goes still to NASCAR, and the suspensions continue. They got one more week suspensions for the crew chiefs, but they get all their points back, and it changed the game. And a lot of teams and crew chiefs that were anonymous, what we don't know, were basically very, very frustrated and upset and disappointed by the decisions, basically saying that we're going to lose the garage here. It's going to become the Wild Wild West. Frustration, disappointed, half pregnant, all those comments were made this past weekend by the crew chiefs. And some of the drivers as well, I think, are really frustrated by this decision as well. And I 100% agree with the drivers and the teams here that are frustrated with the Hendrick Motorsports appeal. Some teams even believe there might be some bias in the garage as well toward Hendrick Motorsports, including, I think, even Denny Hamlin or Jeff Gluck even mentioned this on his podcast the past week, that basically that some of the teams feel like that basically there's a lot of those issues going on where they believe there's a little bit biased toward Hendrick Motorsports. And I completely agree with these teams, the frustration here, because one of the rules with this next-gen car is you're not supposed to touch the next-gen car and make any changes. Even NASCAR tells you with bad communication, you're still not supposed to touch it. But NASCAR agrees. Basically, they were disappointed with the decision that they got their points back. They wanted the points penalty to stay around, and they're really frustrated about the fact that the points penalty didn't stay around because that's the biggest portion of the rule. You're not supposed to modify these parts. And the fact that Hendrick Motorsports got away with it and they got their points back, that's going to frustrate the teams, especially that are basically been following the rules, haven't done anything wrong. Hendrick basically got away with it, and in my opinion, when it comes to this, I do believe that Hendrick Motorsports got away with something here, and now they're back in contention. Now they dominate another race and got a win at Richmond with Kyle Larson getting it done this past weekend at Richmond. And obviously, a lot of team owners not happy about it, and rightfully so, because you don't want it to becoming the Wild Wild West, and you don't want that to end up happening where teams are going to get away with it, and then the best teams are going to win. The goal of the next-gen car was to make the field a little more closer and a little bit more competitive, and have teams like Trackhouse contend. have teams like RSR contend for wins. This is going to hurt that if teams don't stop this, and NASCAR needs to get their ball down. Now, obviously, you got two of the Hendrick cars going to the R&D Center, that being Alex Bowman and William Byron, which is very interesting that they chose those two to go to the garage and not anybody else. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see if those guys get penalties going forward in the future. But they also, at this point, we'll see what happens going forward in the future. And now we're going ahead to jump on to the next story of today's episode as we're talking about respect in the garage. Now, over the last week or two, really since the Atlanta weekend, there's been a lot of talk about the lack of respect in the NASCAR garage. And multiple veteran drivers actually responded to this to talk about this as well. The first one to really talk about it was Kyle Busch, and he says it stems from how these younger guys are trained to race, which I do agree with Kyle Busch on that front. A lot of these younger guys are raised to be really, really aggressive and not really care on the racetrack. Then Denny Hamlin and Kevin Harvick also talked about the situation as well. And Denny Hamlin says that basically the times have changed with NASCAR and how they do it, basically saying that with cameras being around and all that stuff, you can't go talk to drivers and basically can't punch somebody anymore. And Kevin Harvick also says that times have changed as well when it comes to aggression. Kevin Harvick even admits that he was involved with some of that aggression as well. I think the biggest thing is that the lack of respect has really gotten worse, especially over the last couple of years. And you think about some of the drivers coming in. A lot of these drivers that are even coming to Cup now were born after the passing of Dale Sr. And a lot of drivers coming in didn't race before Dale Sr.'s passing. No one that's full-time in the Cup Series right now raced before Dale Sr.'s passing. And I think there's a lack of respect and etiquette on the track because the veteran drivers, they don't know what to do about it. They're frustrated by the lack of etiquette and a lack of respect on the track. And as a fan of the sport, yes, you want to have aggressive racing and stuff, but you also want to have respectful racing on the racetrack as well. And to see the lack of respect on the racetrack we've seen, especially over the last couple of years, is a little bit frustrating to see because, again, it's just seeing the drivers just race with their heads up their butts. And I think generally we saw a little bit this issue at Richmond, but it was really Denny Hamlin, Ryan Blaney. And most of the other drivers raced clean and with a lot of respect, except the lap cars, of course, who couldn't get out of the way. But as a fan, I don't want to see these drivers running over each other and showing lack of respect. The plan for me, if I was a driver, I wouldn't run somebody over. I know times have changed. I know these next-gen cars have really exacerbated this. But it's just something interesting to see that there's just these drivers just show no respect anymore. And it's disappointing to see because it makes it like the Wild Wild West and drivers don't care anymore. You got to do what you got to do to win, but you also got to show respect on the track. And I hope going forward this can change and we can change this mentality where these drivers don't show it, but I'm a little worried that is not going to happen. It's only going to get worse. And you think about this next-gen car with the safety and stuff, you think, yes, this car is a little more durable, but the next-gen safety has been an issue, and it needs to get changed quickly because, man, it's going to be frustrating watching less drivers, especially from open wheel and stuff, are going to come over and race in NASCAR. And we just look like idiots as fans watching and stuff, seeing all this stupidity out on the racetrack. And I hope it changes going forward, and I hope that we see some changes, especially in the procedures of these tracks going forward. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next major story of today's episode as we're talking about Christopher Bell, Ross Chastain, and William Byron. Now, on the second to last restart, and the final caution came out due to a situation between William Byron and Christopher Bell. William Byron was basically running fourth on the outside. He came off pit road, I believe, fourth at the time, lost a couple spots on pit road, actually came in as the leader, and lost some spots on pit road. On the restart, Christopher Bell basically had Ross Chastain on the inside of him, sends it to the bottom, and Christopher Bell completely overreacted to this situation, went out to the racetrack a little bit, had cars on his outside, and got into William Byron, spinning him out, taking William Byron out of a potential day where he could have easily won. Well, after the race, Christopher Bell, instead of initially apologizing to William Byron for the incident, he went on to blame Ross Chastain and called Ross Chastain a wrecking ball after the incident. And I don't understand how Christopher Bell initially was blaming Ross Chastain for the incident. Yes, Ross went to the inside, but Ross made a clean move to the inside of the racetrack. And I just don't understand how Christopher Bell can blame Ross Chastain for the incident. I know it's easy to blame Ross Chastain for the incident, and he's done that before too. You go back to Michigan last year, where he basically blamed Ross Chastain for that incident. And I just don't understand how Christopher Bell is blaming Ross Chastain. And Ross Chastain, after that, basically said, all these guys walk by me and basically don't say anything to me and say anything to my face, but they'll say it to a phone and say it to a camera. Calling out Kyle Busch in that incident, also calling out Christopher Bell and all the other drivers who tried to call Ross Chastain out and basically said that he did nothing wrong in the incident. It was a clean move. And in my opinion, I agree with Chastain's incident. I know it's easy to blame Ross Chastain for these incidents, but Ross Chastain was not at fault for the incident on the racetrack. I don't understand why the drivers and Christopher blamed him. Now, eventually, Christopher did go on Twitter say, I made a mistake and overreacted, and I wanted to apologize to William Byron. But he also should apologize to Ross Chastain because that was completely on Christopher Bell. He made the mistake. He should take full responsibility and should not blame Ross Chastain for that. I thought that was a little bit ridiculous to see that Bell blaming Chastain. But again, I don't know why he didn't blame him there. That was completely Christopher Bell's fault. And I'm glad that Bell at least apologized to William Byron. But again, that was not on Ross Chastain in any shape or form. I know it's easy to blame Ross Chastain on incidents, but 100%, that was on Christopher Bell. He made the mistake. I'm glad he eventually admitted to it and owned up to the incident. But again, why would you initially blame Ross Chastain? Chastain's an easy guy to go after, I guess, especially after Gateway last year. It's an easy guy to go after, but it was not at all on Ross Chastain. That was completely on Christopher Bell, and he should have immediately taken responsibility. I'm glad he eventually did, but in my opinion, that was completely on Christopher Bell for getting into William Byron. Byron should definitely be a little frustrated about that because Byron has had a good year, and Christopher Bell just made a little mistake and got a little bit overreacting, and basically then decided to go ahead and let's go blame Christopher Bell for the incident because that was clearly on. Let's blame Ross Chastain because it's clearly Ross Chastain's fault, even though clearly Bell was the one who made the mistake out on the racetrack. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the next major story of today's episode as we're talking about Chip Ganassi Racing. Now, we've kind of talked about some stuff from the Dale Jr. down in regards to Junior Motorsports essentially jumping up to the Cup Series next year, trying to get a chart and looking at the charter price as well. But one thing I did not talk about from that episode is Chip Ganassi Racing. And with Chip Ganassi being there, Chip Ganassi talked about that he's not ruling out a potential possibility of returning to the NASCAR Cup Series. And shout out to Austin Kennedy from Sportsnet putting out an article on this. He's not ruling out a potential possibility of returning to NASCAR. Chip Ganassi says, I wouldn't say I'd never come back to NASCAR or anything like that. I'm not saying I'm gone forever. I'm happy to come back if someone just gives us the right opportunity. Now, Chip Ganassi Racing did race in NASCAR for many, many years, from 2001 up until the 2021 season. They won a lot of races with drivers like Sterling Marlin, Kyle Larson, Jay McMurray, and also Kurt Busch got 2 or 3 wins for the team as well. But Chip Ganassi Racing was not always a team that was going to win championships. Their best years were in the beginning with Sterling Marlin, and then in 2017 with Kyle Larson. But Chip Ganassi Racing was never a really competitive team, unlike their team in IndyCar, unlike their teams in IMSA. Chip Ganassi Racing, a team that has shown a lot of success in other forms, but also did have some success in NASCAR. It would be amazing, though, to see Chip Ganassi Racing, though, come back and race in NASCAR. Obviously, they sold a lot of their stuff off to Trackhouse Racing, and it looks at Trackhouse Racing, how fast they've been. You look at how good they've been. I think a lot of that has come from Chip Ganassi Racing, because Ross Chastain was originally at Chip Ganassi Racing before he went over and drove for Trackhouse Racing. But you look at Ganassi Racing, would they ever come back? I think so. And I think that Chip Ganassi Racing coming back to NASCAR in general, I believe, would be really, really good for the sport, considering the success that they've had in NASCAR and how quick they've been. And Chip Ganassi Racing does have a lot of money. But again, he is going to have to get a charter if he's going to get back in the sport. And right now, very similar to Junior Motorsports, charters are going to be very difficult to get, especially with the next TV deal coming into play here very, very soon, because that next TV deal is coming up in the next year. And obviously, that's going to be decided by the end of this year. And we're getting closer to finding out what the next TV deal is generally going to look like. Now, do I think Chip Ganassi will get in 2024? I don't know. It's going to be tough to say. But I think maybe in the next 2 years, they will return to NASCAR. And I think there's a good chance that they will get back to the NASCAR in the foreseeable future in the Cup Series. And if they were to come back next year, though, what drivers should they look at? Well, one of them, I think, of course, has to be Josh Berry. Josh Berry's been extremely successful and has done a lot of great things in NASCAR already, especially the Cup Series and the Xfinity Series. He would be a great driver to go with. And then you also have to look at Matt DiBenedetto potentially. I know I mentioned Matt DiBenedetto a lot, but Matt DiBenedetto has been a driver who's really outperformed his equipment in the past, especially with the Wood Brothers, and has shown this past year or two that I think the equipment is not that great at Wood Brothers, and I think Matty D was completely outperforming the equipment at the Wood Brothers, and he's been solid with Frackley. He's gotten a win with Frackley. He's had a lot of electrical gremlins, but I think Matty D could be a pretty solid driver to go with. And they've got other drivers who could be potential candidates. I mean, Eric Jones, for all that matter, if that team became available, it could be a possibility for them to go with Eric Jones. That could be a potential shout and a possibility. And then other drivers they could go after as well. But I think Chip Ganassi, there's a chance they come back this year, the upcoming year in 2024. But I don't know if they come back in 2024. I think that if they were to come back, it would be 2025. But it's all going to depend on the next TV deal. Because, again, the TV deal is going to be really important. And I think if you're going to go into Cup, you got to do it now more than ever. If you're going to get in the Cup Series, you need to deal for the next TV deal is signed. And that likely will be announced sometime in September or sometime in October. It's going to be one thing to watch for sure to see if Chip Ganassi Racing decides to make the decision to come back to NASCAR or not. But I do believe that there's a good chance and a good possibility that we could see Chip Ganassi Racing have a shot and an opportunity to make a return to the Cup Series maybe in 2024. I'm not betting on it. And hey, maybe out of nowhere, maybe they get Carl Edwards to come back. I'd be cool if Carl Edwards came back and ran for Chip Ganassi Racing. Because remember, Carl Edwards almost drove for Chip Ganassi Racing in 2020. He was the first driver Chip Ganassi Racing approached, so maybe that's who they could go with as well. But I think nonetheless it's going to be interesting to see what Chip Ganassi Racing decides to do if they ever come back to NASCAR or not. I think they would do a better job in NASCAR if they came back this time around than they've done in the past, and they would probably hire the best teams and the best drivers they can to be extremely successful. So we'll see what happens going forward if Chip Ganassi Racing decides to come back, but they're not ruling out that, and they could come back in the foreseeable future. And now we're going ahead and jump on to the final major story of today's episode as we're talking about Kurt Busch. Now, we talk about Kurt Busch a lot on this channel, especially very recently, and it has a lot to do with the fact about a potential return to NASCAR. Now, Kurt Busch has not raced in the NASCAR Cup Series since that situation happened at Pocono. He was supposed to run the 45 car at Pocono, but during that, he suffered concussion-like symptoms and has suffered a concussion situation. And since then, Kurt Busch has not been medically cleared to race in NASCAR. Now, this past week, Kurt Busch spoke on SiriusXM NASCAR Radio and spoke about a potential return. And Austin Ganassi from Sportsnet put out the article as well, so shout out to him for that. But Kurt Busch says, yeah, I just have to take the steps to get back to full-time or a cup car. Starts with go-karts, simulators. Could call Kyle Busch and go run his late model at Hickory, do 300, 400 laps. There is also a third potential car, 2311 Racing, and see where he goes from there. And Kurt Busch continues to take the right steps and the right ways to get back behind the wheel. And again, going back and talking about Kurt Busch, we talked about a little about this week. It's interesting that Kurt Busch mentions full time because I think Kurt Busch easily wants to get back behind the wheel. You saw the emotion at COTA, and he just missed racing in NASCAR altogether. And he wants to get back because a lot of people initially thought when Kurt Busch announced he'd be retiring from full-time racing, they thought he'd be retiring altogether. But Kurt Busch has indicated in the past that he's not done racing altogether and wants to get back behind the wheel of a race car. But he has to first get medically cleared. And I do believe that Kurt Busch is taking the right steps to get back behind the wheel. He's not just wanting to jump right back in. He's taking the right steps. Do I think Kurt Busch will get back behind the wheel in 2023? Yes. When do I think he'll get back? I think it'll be a little bit later in the year. He still first, though, has to get medically cleared by the doctors, which he is working towards that. And I think he's been doing a really good job doing that. He's been following the doctor's orders. But it's good to see we're getting more and more positive updates. And this is the best update we've gotten about Kurt Busch. Really, he's got to first get back into simulator. He's been working in the simulators. He's been doing go-karting and stuff. And he's been doing the right things. And he's been doing a good job in the booth as well. But also, mentioning about that third cup car at 2311 Racing, as let's transition to that for a second, that's pretty interesting. We've already seen a third car for 2311 Racing. We've seen that with Travis Pastrana. And maybe, just maybe, if the third car comes into play to get a third charter for the car, maybe they go after somebody to go full-time in their car next year in 2024 if Kurt Busch doesn't become available. So what about maybe driver like Matt DiBenedetto? What about Josh Berry? Those two could be possibilities. John Hunter Nemechek, he drove for 2311 Racing in the past. He could be a potential shout. He nearly drove for Tyler Reddick a couple weekends ago at Atlanta, so he could be a good shout. Sammy Smith's probably being looked at, and then maybe other drivers could be a shout and a possibility. Maybe Carl Edwards, they get him out of retirement somehow. Who knows at this particular point, but nonetheless, transitioning back to Kurt Busch, if Kurt does come back, I think it's going to be really awesome to see him back in the sport because I will be honest, I'm missing Kurt Busch back behind the wheel. But I want Kurt Busch to continue taking the right steps to get back behind the wheel of a race car because if he takes the right steps, I think he will be in a really good shape as a race car driver. I don't want him coming back at a track where it's too difficult. And if he comes back full-time, that's going to be really, really cool. But I think if he comes back, it will be part-time. But we'll have to wait and see what he does decide to do in that situation. But I think he'll be back potentially back in 2023. He's also, though, doing a great job at 2311 Racing. I know he's ruled out maybe being an owner at 2311 Racing, but he's been a really good part of 2311 Racing. He's not only helped out Tyler Reddick, but has also helped Bubba Wallace out as well. And I think he's going to continue to help out Bubba Wallace as well. And he really believes in this team and really believes in it. And he saw the emotion. He's been really good about it. He's been holding it back and doing a really good job. And it shows his character has changed, especially in the last 10 years. It's really shown how quick his character has changed. So I'm really happy for Kurt Busch. I'm really happy to see that he's getting better, hopefully. And hopefully we'll see him back behind the wheel in the foreseeable future. I miss seeing Kurt behind the wheel of a race car, and I just hope he continues to take the right steps to get back behind the wheel of a Cup Series car, because I miss seeing him behind the wheel, and hopefully he'll be back behind the wheel of a Cup car in the foreseeable future. So that is for today's NASCAR news and motorsports news video. I want to thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe to the channel, notifications on so you know if I win a video does go live on my channel. Follow me Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and support my Patreon as well. Let's get you below that and comment your thoughts below on today's video. Do you think that Kurt Busch will return to the Cup Series in 2023 or not? Let me know in the comments below. And what are your thoughts about Chip Ganassi Racing not ruling out a potential return to the Cup Series? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Later today on the channel, I should have the Truck Series race picks for the Truck Series race at Bristol. If not, that will come out on Tuesday. And we'll also have the intros for the Cup race at Bristol out as well on Tuesday. Then on Wednesday, we're going to have a NASCAR news video on the channel. And then maybe Thursday, we'll also have race picks for the Cup race as well. Keep your eyes out on that because I got a lot of videos dropping here. And also, Silly Season Predictions is coming out very, very soon. And I think you guys are going to enjoy that. So anyways, like I said, I want to thank you guys for watching today's episode, and I'll see you guys next time for some more great, awesome NASCAR content and other motorsports content on the channel like this. Take care, everybody.